The soft glow of chandeliers filled the luxury restaurant, casting a golden light over the pristine white tablecloths. The air was thick with the scent of expensive wine and gourmet cuisine. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, catering to the city's wealthiest diners. Among them sat a man alone at a table in the corner. His dark, worn-out leather jacket and slightly unkempt hair made him stand out in a place like this. He looked tired, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. A waitress, sharp-eyed and poised, approached his table. Her gaze flicked over him, taking in his rugged appearance with barely concealed disdain. She had served celebrities, CEOs, and royalty, but this man, he didn't belong here. With a tight smile, she placed a menu in front of him, already assuming he wouldn't be able to afford a single item. "Sir, our restaurant has a strict policy. We only serve guests who can actually pay," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. The man looked up slowly, his deep eyes calm but unreadable. He didn't argue. He didn't snap back. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he had heard these words 100 times before. Other diners began to glance over, sensing the tension. Some whispered to each other, trying to figure out who this stranger was and why he dared to walk into a place like this. What the waitress didn't realize, what no one in the room knew, was that this man wasn't just another customer. He wasn't lost or out of place. He wasn't someone they could just turn away. In fact, the very restaurant she worked for, belonged to him, And in just a few moments, she was going to find out in the most unexpected way. The waitress crossed her arms, tapping her fingers against her elbow as she waited for the man to respond. When he didn't, she sighed dramatically and glanced around, making sure other guests were watching. "Sir, maybe you didn't hear me," she said, her voice louder this time. "This is an exclusive restaurant. We don't serve people who can't afford it." A few chuckles echoed from nearby tables. Someone whispered, "Why is he even here?" The man, still silent, reached for the glass of water in front of him, taking a slow sip as if completely unaffected by her words. Annoyed, the waitress leaned in closer. "Look, I'm just trying to save you the embarrassment. A meal here costs more than some people make in a month," she added with a smirk. The insult lingered in the air, but the man didn't react. He simply placed the glass back on the table and met her gaze. There was something unsettling about how calm he was. It wasn't arrogance or defiance, it was something else. A manager, noticing the situation, hurried over, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, glancing between the waitress and the man. The waitress huffed. "I was just explaining to him that this might not be the right place for him." The manager gave the man a once-over, and for a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition. But before he could speak, the waitress continued, "Look at him. He doesn't belong here." The man exhaled softly, finally breaking his silence. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. He tilted his head slightly, studying the waitress, as if deciding something. The manager cleared his throat, suddenly looking nervous. I think we should." But before he could finish, the restaurant doors swung open, and a sharply dressed man in a tailored suit rushed inside, his eyes scanning the room. The moment he spotted the mysterious diner, his face paled, and he hurried toward the table. The waitress frowned, confused. "Who is that?" she whispered, but she was about to get an answer she never expected. The sharply dressed man rushed toward the table, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His expression was tense, his eyes locked onto the seated man as if he had just realized a terrible mistake had been made. The waitress noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere and took a step back, unsure of what was happening. The other guests, sensing something unusual, watched in silence. Mr. Reeves, the suited man, breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands twitched slightly, as if he wasn't sure whether to offer a handshake or apologize on the spot. The waitress blinked in confusion. Wait, Reeves. As in Keanu Reeves. She let out a nervous chuckle, glancing at the diners around her. No way. That can't be him. The man in the leather jacket finally moved. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet power that demanded attention. He didn't have to say anything. The weight of his presence alone spoke volumes. The manager, now visibly sweating, turned to the waitress, his voice tight with panic. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed. "This restaurant, this entire place, belongs to him." The words hung in the air like a slow-motion explosion. The waitress felt the blood drain from her face. Her mouth opened, then closed as she struggled to process the information. "No, that's not possible," she muttered. He came in looking like... Her voice trailed off as the reality sank in. Keanu finally spoke, his tone even but firm. "And what exactly did I look like?" His question wasn't aggressive, but it carried weight. The waitress swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had assumed he was just another struggling nobody, someone who had wandered in by mistake. But now, with everyone staring, with the truth out in the open, she realized she had judged him completely wrong. The room was silent, the tension thick. Then Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "So," he said, his voice calm. "What happens now?" The waitress stood frozen, her mind racing as the weight of her mistake crushed down on her. She had insulted Keanu Reeves. Not just a random guest, not just some unknown man, but the actual owner of the restaurant. The same man she had dismissed, humiliated, and treated like he didn't belong. Now every set of eyes in the room was locked on her, waiting to see what would happen next. The manager, his face pale, took a deep breath and turned to Keanu with a forced smile. "Mr. Reeves, I sincerely apologize for this misunderstanding." His voice wavered slightly, as if he wasn't sure how to fix what had already been done. "If there's anything we can do..." Keanu raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. The movement was slow, controlled, but it silenced the entire room. The waitress's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just about an apology. This was something much bigger. She quickly tried to regain control, forcing an awkward laugh. "Mr. Reeves, I didn't realize who you were," she stammered, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I mean, you didn't look like..." She caught herself, realizing that no matter how she finished that sentence, it wouldn't sound right. Keanu tilted his head slightly, watching her. The silence dragged on, stretching the moment unbearably. Then finally he spoke. "So if I wasn't me, if I were just some regular guy, you would have had no problem turning me away." His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone. Something measured, thoughtful, almost disappointed. The waitress's throat went dry. She glanced at the manager for help, but he was too busy avoiding eye contact, pretending he wasn't part of this disaster. She tried again. "It's just, this is a luxury place, you know. We have to be careful about who we let in." Keanu exhaled slowly, nodding as if considering her words. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "Tell me," he said, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear, "who exactly is we?" The question cut through the air like a blade. The waitress had no answer. She could feel the judgment radiating from the other guests, the same people who had laughed along with her just minutes ago. And now, with each second that passed, the realization hit her harder and harder. She had made a mistake she couldn't take back. The tension in the room was unbearable, every breath heavy with anticipation. Keanu sat back, watching her struggle, waiting. The waitress felt her heart pounding, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The waitress's breath came in short, uneven bursts. The weight of Keena's questions still hung in the air, suffocating her. She had no answer, at least, not one that wouldn't make her sound even worse. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The other diners, who had once chuckled at the scene unfolding, now looked uneasy, shifting in their seats as if suddenly realizing they, too, had been quick to judge. Just when it seemed like the tension couldn't climb any higher, the restaurant doors swung open again. This time, a woman in a sleek black dress walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She looked important, like someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. She scanned the room before locking eyes with Keanu, her expression shifting instantly from composed to shocked. "Mr. Reeves," she said, making her way toward the table. The moment she spoke, the manager turned a shade paler. The waitress noticed his reaction and frowned. Who was this woman? And why did she seem just as nervous as he was? Keanu gave her a small nod, acknowledging her presence. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge now. The woman let out a breath, glancing around the room before lowering her voice. "I was just made aware of everything." She shot a sharp look at the manager, who swallowed hard and looked away. "This is not how we run things here." The waitress's stomach dropped. Something about the way she said that made it clear. This wasn't just about a rude employee or a single bad interaction. This was bigger. Keanu folded his hands together on the table, studying the woman carefully. "So tell me," he said, his tone light but deliberate, "if this isn't how you run things, why does it keep happening?" The woman froze. The manager's head snapped up, and the waitress felt her pulse skyrocket. What did he mean by that? The restaurant had fallen into an eerie silence, everyone on edge. Keanu wasn't just here for a meal. He was here for something else. And whatever it was, they were all about to find out. The storm was fierce now, its winds howling through the shattered windows as Amelia clutched the old journal in her hands. She had been searching for answers for days, driven by an overwhelming need to know the truth. The final piece of the puzzle had been right in front of her all along, buried in the pages of the diary, written in a shaky hand, her father's handwriting. It contained a secret that shook her to her core. The family treasure, the one she had spent so much time chasing, was never about gold or jewels. It was about power, something far more dangerous, and her father had been trying to keep it hidden, even at the cost of his own life. She heard a knock at the door. Tension filled the air, and her heart raced. She opened it slowly, expecting to see Daniel, the man she had trusted, the man who had been her partner in this pursuit. But standing before her was someone else entirely, her mother, who had disappeared years ago. Her eyes were filled with sorrow, but also a deep, unsettling calm. "You finally found it," her mother said quietly, her voice low but filled with undeniable authority. "Everything your father tried to protect you from, it's all coming for you now." Amelia stared in disbelief. "What are you talking about? You knew about this all along." Her mother nodded, her expression unreadable. "I had to leave, Amelia, to protect you, to keep you safe from what the treasure really was. And now it's too late. They'll come for you. They'll stop at nothing to take what belongs to them." Amelia's mind was racing. The journal had mentioned something about a legacy, a bloodline that had been marked for a purpose. But she had never imagined this. Her own mother, part of a secret network of people protecting the treasure, caught in a web of betrayal and danger. As her mother spoke of their enemies, Amelia could hear footsteps outside, the unmistakable sound of boots on the wooden floor. It was too late to escape. Suddenly, Daniel burst through the door, his face wild with panic. "Amelia, you have to come with me. It's not over. They're already here." The confusion in Amelia's eyes was replaced by a fierce determination. "I won't run anymore," she said, gripping the journal tightly. "I know what's at stake now." As they turned to face the hallway, the door slammed open with a deafening crash, and men in dark suits stormed inside, their faces cold and unreadable. One of them stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Amelia's. "You're too late," he said, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "The treasure is ours." Amelia's pulse raced, but she felt an unexpected surge of clarity. "You're wrong," she said, standing tall despite the overwhelming fear. "It's not about the treasure. It's about what happens next." She reached into the folds of her jacket and pulled out a small, unassuming key, one she had discovered hidden inside her father's journal. It was the key to the vault, the real treasure. As she stepped forward, she held it up, and to everyone's surprise, the leader of the group hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. But then, as the men closed in, everything changed. The walls of the house began to shake, and the sound of distant rumblings filled the air. The ground beneath them cracked open, and what emerged from the earth was something beyond their understanding. A massive stone tablet, ancient and inscribed with markings that glowed faintly. Amelia watched in awe as the leader's eyes widened in horror. "No," he whispered, realizing too late that the real power wasn't in the treasure, but in the knowledge that had been buried for centuries. Before anyone could act, the tablet began to hum, a bright light shooting from its center. The men were thrown backward, their bodies collapsing as if the energy had sucked the very life from them. Amelia's heart raced as she looked around at the devastation, realizing that the conflict she had been a part of was nothing more than a trigger for something far bigger, something that had always been out of her control. And then, as the last man fell, the light dimmed, leaving only the cold, quiet aftermath. Amelia turned to her mother, who was now standing beside her, her expression filled with both relief and regret. "You should have never come here," her mother said softly. "Now you're part of it all, too." Amelia swallowed hard, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She had uncovered a legacy far darker than she ever could have imagined. And as the storm outside raged on, she realized there was no turning back. The world had changed, and so had she. The silence that followed the explosion of light was deafening. Amelia stood there, her body still humming with the energy that had coursed through the air, as the last remnants of the dark figures crumbled away. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Asterisk now, you're part of it all asterisk." But what did that truly mean? Amelia looked down at the key in her hand, still grasping it as though it were the only tether to reality. It had unlocked something far beyond her understanding, something both terrifying and enlightening. But it also held the key to her own future. Her father's legacy was now hers to carry, a responsibility she hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. She glanced over at her mother, who remained motionless, her face a mixture of sorrow and resignation. "How do we undo all this?" Amelia asked, her voice shaking. "Is there any way to stop it?" Her mother sighed deeply, her eyes filled with a sadness that spoke of years of secrets, of choices made in the shadows. "You can't undo it, but you can make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands again. That's what your father tried to do, protect you from this world. But it's yours now, whether you like it or not." Amelia nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. She realized that no matter how much she wanted to turn away from this legacy, the truth was clear. The world had changed, and she had a role to play in what was to come. As she and her mother stood there, the house slowly came back to life, the storm outside clearing. It was as if the chaos had been a storm within her own soul, one that was finally subsiding. They didn't speak much after that. There was no need for words. Amelia had her path now, one that would take her into uncharted waters, but it was hers to navigate. The key she held wasn't just a symbol of the past, it was a bridge to the future. And as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, Amelia understood. The real treasure had never been gold or jewels. It was the choice to create a future free from the shadows of the past, no matter how heavy the legacy might be.